Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit round it and pluck blackberries." Notice where you are as we begin this response to the lecture on gratitude and climate change. Perhaps notice the chair holding you, the floor holding the chair, the earth holding the floor. Notice anything growing around you, plants, trees, pets, people. Take a deep breath in. Let that breath go. Allow yourself to be fully in the environment where you are, connected with your mind to the words I'm about to share, but also connected in your body and your spirit. Bring your holistic attention to the place you are. In a time where technology allows us to constantly connect, we can also experience disconnection from one another, our world, and even our bodies, as life is lived through screens. For now, I encourage you to be present with yourself and with me, even as we are in different geographical locations. My name is Bethany Ferguson, and I am a fourth-year PhD student in the Fuller School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy. I'm originally from the American South. I'm the oldest daughter of a Presbyterian minister and an English teacher. So perhaps with a background in religion and stories and poetry, I was always destined to move into psychology. As I begin my response to today's lecture, it's important for me to state that I've been shaped by my faith tradition, my family background, and my cultural environment. Also of note, before I came to Fuller, I spent over a decade living outside of the United States, working in counseling, education, and faith-based community development in Uganda, South Sudan, and Kenya. These experiences grew my psychological research interests and my desire to work in psychotherapy and assessment, and ultimately brought me to be a part of the Headington Research Lab, where I focused my research on trauma, spirituality, and culture. My practice of intentional gratitude began when I lived in South Sudan. It was a place where I was welcomed with grace into a new community and found the joy of building cross-cultural connections and relationships. I found meaningful work in education and counseling, and was inspired by the resilience, tenacity, and humor of those I worked with. It was also a place of ongoing political conflict and resource insecurity, and it was often very dry and very hot. During my time living there, South Sudan had one of the highest infant and maternal mortality rates in the world, and many people lived on less than $1 a day. In the face of so much challenge, I found myself struggling with discouragement and anxiety, and so my colleagues and I began a communal gratitude list. Each month, we would draw or write what we were grateful for on a large piece of paper displayed in a common room. The practice of gratefulness brought hope and motivation for endurance in a challenging situation. However, hidden behind the practice of gratitude was the reality of grief, loss, and injustice. We cultivated gratitude because in the face of so much difficulty, we sometimes forgot to express our gratitude. But we did not lose awareness of the pain and injustice all around us. When we consider the world and our place in it, there's always a tension. There's beauty and awe, there's grief and loss. I was recently on a hike in the San Gabriel Mountains near my house, just as the sun was setting. I found myself exclaiming again and again on the beauty of the hike and how privileged I felt to be there. But at the same time, there was evidence of erosion and landslides from the many hikers, just like me, who had gratefully climbed the mountain, and in so doing, had eroded the beauty. We always hold a tension of gratitude, of beauty for the world, and grief for a world where there's always loss and destruction. And often humans are the cause of this loss and destruction. We know the ways we interact with our environment impact us and the environment. Every day, we are confronted with a myriad of small and large decisions. Plastic bags or reusable bags, purchasing pre-packaged food items, flying on planes, setting the thermostat in our houses. Dr. Emmons has argued that, quote, gratitude is vital for individual and collective flourishing, and the capacity for human flourishing is surely limited under the extremes of climate change, end quote. There's a tension between individual momentary flourishing and broader, more nuanced understandings of flourishing. For example, I lived internationally for many years without indoor plumbing. Thus, I am grateful daily for access to a hot shower or an indoor toilet. I also lived for years in places where people did not have access to clean water, and I'm cognizant of the ways water usage in the United States may strain the environment and increase the likelihood of water shortages. Thus, as long as we live in a world where, according to a 2019 report by the World Health Organization, 785 million people do not have access to basic water services, clean water is an issue of concern for us all. Toilet flushing alone accounts for 30% of household water usage. How does my gratefulness for the current privilege of access to indoor plumbing intersect with my grief that 785 million people do not have access to water services, and concern that ongoing overuse of water resources may impact water access in the future? What will empower us to navigate the complexities of our current environmental challenges? I would add that, adding to Dr. Emmons' foundation of gratefulness, we must bring a humble awareness of our interconnectedness. Dr. Martin Luther King, in a sermon in 1967, stated, "Now, let me suggest first that if we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. We must develop a world perspective. No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone. And as long as we try, the more we are going to have war in this world. It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality." Until I see that my thriving is connected to the thriving of those around me and the thriving of the world, I will have difficulty engaging for environmental change that will not seem to directly benefit my individual thriving. As Dr. Emmons mentioned, we must consider not only individual, but also collective flourishing. This involves humility. Carrie Danner, in her article entitled "Hope, Courage, and Resistance During Climate Change: Insights from African American Economic Cooperative Practices," states this: "This decentering aspect of humility awakens us to our interdependence on others." For example, during my time working in South Sudan, most of my Sudanese colleagues were involved in agriculture in some way. Given lack of regulation in Sudan, potentially harmful pesticides were available. I spoke with a friend about the potential long-term risks of pesticides. He looked at me with some suspicion and stated that the United States had used these pesticides to get rich and grow food, and now I wanted him not to be able to have the same access to food. Here, I became aware of how food practices and wealth accumulation in my home country impacted environmental decision-making in a small South Sudanese village a world away from my passport country. Danner goes on to state, "Those at the margins have more immediate, or perhaps just conscious experience of institutions and systems outside of their control. For many privileged people today, the magnitude of uncertainty and the degree with which they are confronted by it is new, however. The likelihood of water shortages, displaced populations, and toxic oceans is unsettling. All members of society are now enmeshed in a web of environmentally destructive resource extraction, production, distribution, and disposal of goods. We are often unsure which actions will produce the best results. Fundamentally, an accurate understanding of self in context reveals the limits of individual power. Humility helps correct the moral vision of both the privileged and the marginalized, and points to the strength, even the necessity, of communal responses." The end of Danner's quote. Perhaps then embodiment and familial connections are helpful ways to humbly consider our interconnectedness, thus creating space both for grief and gratitude. Sally McFaig, in her book, The Body of God, an Ecological Theology, states, "Creation as the place of salvation means that the health and well-being of all creatures and parts of creation is what salvation is all about. It is God's place and our place, the one and only place." Craig Santos Perez, in his ecological poem Rings of Fire, compares his daughter's spiking fever to the fires of California and the rising temperatures of South Sudan, noting fires and drought to be symptoms of an earth that is not fully healthy. His poetry directs us to bring the same concern and care towards the earth that we would bring to an unhealthy daughter or loved one, and to also consider how art and poetry can propel environmental activism. Every planting season in South Sudan, my small Episcopal church in Okari would gather to bless the seeds. We would engage in prayers, songs, dances, and a meal together to acknowledge the mystery of an earth shaped by God and cultivated by people that we depend on for food for another season of life. We would share seeds with one another, make plans to plant together, and anticipate how communal cultivation could lead to communal celebration and flourishing. Danner states, at the explicitly religious level, uncertainty is part of the burden of Christian discipleship. While Christians proclaim to know how the story ends in resurrection, we do not know the path before us. We need to be humble enough to risk practices that may or may not solve the crisis, but still somehow embody God's presence with us as wayfarers. We not only share the path, but must learn from and even change our path in light of new insights. End of the quote. On this journey towards climate change, gratitude must be joined by acknowledged humility and interconnectedness in order to cultivate a world of healing and flourishing. Thank you so much for your attention today and the opportunity to respond to this talk.